very warm welcome to this debate on was Russia's invasion of Ukraine provoked by Western policy. I'm Robert Maddox, I'm director of Chatham House, the think tank. And I was intrigued when this came across my inbox because of the number of people one can run into on either side of this proposition who don't think it's a debate at all. And we're going to hear, I suspect, some of that this evening, but also have a thoroughly good debate. But let me just quickly introduce the panel. It's a panel in the formal sense of the debate, so we have arguing that Russia's invasion was provoked by Western policy, Robert Skidelsky, who is, as you know, Emeritus Professor of Political Economy at Warwick and a crossbench peer in the House of Lords, and well known for his writing on economic history, particularly his biography of Keynes. And Tony Brenton, Sir Tony Brenton, a former British ambassador to Russia for four very lively years, 2004 to 2008, and a senior diplomat with a lot of expertise in Russian affairs, also fellow at Wolseley College, Cambridge. And on the other side, arguing that Russia's invasion was not provoked by Western policy, John Luff is an associate fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, a former NATO official and a specialist in East-West relations. He's also the author of Germany's Russia Problem and a leading analyst of Russian foreign policy and European security. And Professor Lawrence Friedman is Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College, as you may know, one of the UK's most respected military historians and quoted much on all the strategic problems of our times, including the one we're about to discuss.
We have Russia's invasion was provoked by Western policy 31. Russia's invasion was not provoked by Western policy 45.
Okay, well let's kick off then.
Thanks very much, Bronwyn. Thanks very much, Edward, for organising all this. And thanks so much, everyone, for coming to discuss a subject which has been pretty much taboo over the last 3 years in this country and in this city, which is what the Russians actually think about what's going on. And it is striking to be taboo. I have friends, journalists, professors, whatever, who have almost been cancelled for suggesting that they might write an article or a book trying to explain what they think the Russians. So I'm delighted to be able to try and persuade those of you who were not wise enough to vote for us the first time round that there are very good reasons for believing that Russians were actually provoked into what they're doing. Let me start with a quibble, however. By provoked, I do not mean that this was the sole cause of what the Russians did. What I'm saying is that it was, I'm sure you're all Aristotelian philosophers, it was a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the Russian action. It contributed substantially to what the Russians are crazy. I'm not defending the Russians, the crazy, brutal things the Russians have done, but was not the only Russian point of view I've talked about. I think as I go through, you will see that I'm focusing on the Russian point of view because the question of whether the Russians were provoked finally comes back to what's going on in Russian heads. In particular, of course, one Russian head, which is President Putin. A couple of other points I need to emphasize before I get going properly. You need to understand the deep importance of Ukraine for Russia. Ukraine, Slavic sister, united with Russia for about as long as Scotland has been united with England. I've become more cautious about using that analogy. And the relationship, as vexed as any relationship between a municipal imperial power and one of its colonies, think England and Ireland. All the undertones and complications in that sort of relationship. And the fourth point I would make is about Russia itself. That over the period we're discussing, and indeed still to some extent, the deep cleavage in Russian politics, nothing to do with the political party or any of that, it's between liberal reformers, Democrats, on the one hand, people we encouraged, generated when communism originally collapsed, and between the conservative, nationalist, on the whole authoritarian, on the whole very hostile to the West, alternative group. And the interplay between those two groups has been a big part of the Russian approach to all of this, and part of my thesis is at the end of this process, we've actually given dominance in Russian politics to the wrong guys, to the nationalists, to the Putinites, if you like. Okay, I'm now going to run through very swiftly, as swiftly as I can, aware of Bronwyn's eagle eye upon you there.
It's not as swiftly as you can. You've got 10 minutes.
The actual history of the key issue, as I see it, in pushing Russia the wrong way on all of this, which is Western determination to expand NATO. You come to the Cold War. The Cold War. When I talk about the Cold War to students in Cambridge, so it is if I'm talking about the Trojan War. I'm rather hopeful here that there's a bit more historical memory of that. The end of the Cold War, you have two still surviving just alliance systems. NATO on the one hand, Warsaw Pact on the other hand. Both of them saying we're defensive. What we've done for the last 30 years is defend our side of the argument against the other. The Warsaw Pact, of course, and the other point about them is that each is regarded by the population of the other side as the deep enemy, as the people who are out to get us, out to conquer us. Okay, get into the Cold War, Warsaw Pact disappears because nobody wants to be as a subject of Russia. NATO survives, but there's quite a lot of expectation around, including by me, that it's got to go. The Cold War's over, we're talking about a Europe whole and free, all of that sort of stuff. It's a historic relic which will vanish. And it kind of feels like that for a very short time. And then the question of NATO expansion arises, first of all, in a negative way. Gorbachev, as the Cold War literally ends, as Germany wants to unify, as East Germany joins up with West Germany a member of NATO, East Germany not, question comes, okay, can we include East Germany in NATO? And obviously the answer to that is yes, there's no great cost to that. What sort of price is Russia willing to pay to allow that? And what the Americans, what Jim Baker, the Secretary of State at the time, offers is not 1 inch. NATO will take in East Germany, but will not go 1 inch beyond that line. He says it. Now, people say, because the conventional negotiations do not put that commitment into the final agreement, but he says it in public, Kohl repeats it, Thatcher repeats it, Werner, who was at the time Secretary General of NATO, repeats it. It is generally accepted by the Russians that that is a commitment by the West, even if not written down. And when we come to the point of the subsequent debate, and the West said, of course we never meant it. Of course NATO can expand if we choose to do it. The Russians come away feeling betrayed. You could say, okay, it wasn't in the agreement, this is true, but Gorbachev was much more worried about money than he was about security when the deal was done. At regular moments thereafter, you find the Russians saying, but you promised, and you broke your promise. This was the moment where trust began to evaporate between the two sides as a result of a Western action. Okay, so that's the initial play, and then it all goes quiet for a bit because the Soviet Union is busy collapsing, NATO, as I say, is cast to one side, Warsaw Pact also collapses. And the subject raises itself again with the expansion of NATO, actually under middle period Clinton, when people like the Poles and the Hungarians and the Czechs, now relieved of the Russian yoke, say we want to join NATO. We want protection from the Russians. And Clinton's initial reaction is caution, because he knows that this will be red rag to a Russian bull if he concedes it. He looks for ways of avoiding it. He introduces a thing called Partnership for Peace, which is a sort of waiting room for the eventual thing. And he talks regularly to Yeltsin. He and Yeltsin were quite close buddies in some ways. Yeltsin saying, don't do it. This is the way to really inflame my security sector. They will hate you. And Clinton, for a while, survives on that, but then he does very badly in the 1994 midterms, partly because in Chicago there are lots of Polish heritage voters who firmly back letting Poland into NATO. So Clinton switches. He says, okay, we're going to let them in. And there's then a huge row. Yeltsin, having been delighted by Partnership for Peace, is utterly abject, and the torrent of political, you can guess the word I would have put in there in less graceful company, which is about to come on his head. Clinton pushes forward some negotiations. He produces a thing called the Founding Act, of which Clinton says, okay, our borders move 500 miles closer to Moscow. We absorb all of Russia's former allies. And then we give them this piece of paper as a compensation for what they're about to do. And meanwhile, Yeltsin is making speeches about a cold peace. It's the moment of real chill enters the relationship between Russia and the West. Nevertheless, a friend of mine, a guy called Dmitry Trenin, who was one of the sort of house-trained Russian bureaucrats, says to me, you do this, and the Russian security sector will never trust you again. The Russian security sector matters. It's the dominant bit of the Russian government. Anyway, we go ahead. And a man called George Kennan, who was the great Russian expert, the man who devised the policy of containment, way back at the beginning of the Cold War, who knows Russia backwards, looks at it in horror and says, I'm going to give you the full quotation here, because he's so good, he gets it absolutely right. Bluntly stated, expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Such a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not in our interests. And he was absolutely right on every count. Nevertheless, by now the process had started, moving forward. First expansion takes place in 1990, first enlargement takes place in 1999, which unfortunately is also the year of the Kosovo War. I won't bore you with the details of the Kosovo War, but the Kosovo War was illegal. It was an attack on an ally of Russia, and it was an aggressive war on NATO's part. So the Russians turned around and said, I thought you said NATO was defensive. What is going on here? And at the same time, Gaidar, who is the leading reformer in Russia, says, if you only knew the disaster that you are now inflicting on Russia, you are making it impossible for those of us who care, he's a liberal, care about Russian liberalism and democracy, to achieve that result. First enlargement happens, goes away, leaving a very bad feeling and leaving a lot of damage around. One of the consequences, however, in a way, of that first enlargement of 1999 is that Yeltsin, choosing his successor, looking for a man who will protect the people around him, but also a man, final words to him are, look after Russia, who will protect Russia against its enemies. He picks a man who, amongst other things, is deemed as being ready to stand up to the West, Vladimir Putin. So part of the consequence of NATO enlargement is that we now have Putin to deal with. He arrives, he sets about taking care of Russia, he makes himself clear he's absolutely averse to NATO enlargement. At the beginning, actually, he wants to go soft, he wants to make friends with the Americans, all of that. He talks politely about NATO enlargement, but once it becomes clear that he cannot establish a decent relationship with the Americans, he then goes hard against it. You now move, so the second round of enlargement takes place in 2004. I actually just arrived as Russia's ambassador in that year, and one of the things I was put down to do, we were all doing it, all NATO ambassadors were going around the country, meetings of Russians, ordinary Russians, and so explaining NATO's defensive alliance. Of course we're not planning to attack Russia. And I went to one of these meetings in Ekaterinburg, got up and said all of that, gave all the arguments, and then a bloke, ramrod straight, ex-veteran Russian, got up and said, Почему нам врешь? Why are you lying to us? Evident support from all the other people in the room. And that brought home to me how strongly ordinary Russians felt about this issue. So Putin's there. Okay, I'm getting there. And the initial obvious environment in the enlargement take place, the attention now turns to Ukraine. Because Brzezinski once said, with Ukraine, Russia is an empire. Without Ukraine, it never can be. Ukraine is the focal point in terms of the enlargers who want it want it inside NATO. Now, there's lots of coming and going in Ukrainian politics, which is basically a push and shove between the West and Russia. There's a revolution in 2004, which puts an anti-Russian president in Ukraine, and at that point Ukraine can begin talking quietly to NATO about building expansion. He disappears, is replaced by a pro-Russian. But before that, the Bucharest summit, NATO Bucharest summit in 2008, which by some completely mad process, includes in its conclusions, Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And at this point, all sorts of things happen. Bill Burns, who was in numbers as the US ambassador in Israel at the time, writes a telegram to his bosses in Washington saying, for all Russians, taking Ukraine into NATO, mentioned the importance of Ukraine, is the reddest of red lines. From every Russian we know, from the knuckle-dragging internal inhabitants of the Kremlin to the most liberal of liberals, they all hate the idea that this is their Slavic brother joining the enemy. Ukraine joins again, revolution of dignity. NATO entry is actually written into the Ukrainian constitution at that time. Putin Now, things again have gone relatively quiet, but Putin goes off through COVID, broods on it all, sees, as I say, Russia's closest comrade being dragged, not being dragged, voluntarily entering Ukraine, comes back from his COVID-induced break, says, I'm not going to let this happen. This is contrary to what all of Russian history is about. Masses his troops, presents a set of demands to the West, saying that the central is that Ukraine will not join NATO. We, the West, brush them aside, and the war starts. So I conclude, just to summarise them, the Russians have regularly and forcefully told us that NATO expansion is simply not acceptable. Putin told Bush in Bucharest, we have to worry about our domestic security. You include Ukraine in NATO. He doesn't quite say that's a casus belli, but he uses diplomatic words which amount to the same message. We ignore it all the way down, and well, I'm not going to get the price for that. Thank you.
Thank you. I shall try to make my argument as succinct as Tony. Russia's waging an aggressive war against Ukraine. It's not acting in self-defense because Ukraine did not attack Russia. There may be reasons, we've heard some, why Vladimir Putin ordered the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of February 22, and it may be interesting to explore these reasons. But to be clear, they are not justifications for an aggressive war. There can be no justifications for an aggressive war. In the West, we normally consider the just war tradition when assessing justifications made for the use of armed force. In this tradition, there's an important distinction between cause and conduct, why and how. A just cause means that a war must be undertaken by a lawful authority with good intent to right a serious wrong and be undertaken with a reasonable prospect of success, and then only after exhausting peaceful alternatives and using proportionate means. Just conduct requires not making matters worse, using force proportionate to the wrong to be righted, and sparing non-combatants. So a war needs special justification and men should be fought as humanely as possible. On almost every one of these tests, Russian aggression fails. Let me emphasize here that the question of how a war should be fought is bound up with whether it should be fought at all. I'm not going to labour this point today, but it's important to note that even if the Russian government had kidded itself that this would be a walkover, that it is still stuck in a hopeless campaign after well over 3 years of fighting against a supposedly weaker country with an illegitimate government. Moscow's lack of understanding of Ukraine's determined and resilient national identity is another indicator of Russia's moral as well as military failure. It had no idea of the mess it was getting into and the tragedy it was inflicting upon itself as well as Ukraine. Tim invites us to peer into Putin's head, which is a strange place to go, but if we're going to go, we have to perhaps consider this like a psychiatrist dealing with a patient with paranoia. We may discover that our patient harbours deep and dark thoughts about NATO as well as about Ukraine. And these generate a sense of profound insecurity. That seems to me to be the argument. And sometimes, of course, the paranoid are right. They're right to be worried. But if we discover that there's no reason for them to worry, we may have an explanation for the consequential criminality. They did this terrible thing because they were deranged, but we have no justification. If the Russian government had not fallen prey to its own insecurities and considered the situation more carefully, it would have held fire. We must also be careful because Putin and his propagandists have given a variety of reasons for the invasion at different times. In some accounts, NATO enlargement doesn't enlarge, but in most, and in particular Putin's famous essay of July 2021 on, quotes, the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, NATO is mentioned only once as exercising control over the Ukrainian government, because it's a theme of what the Russians say, that Ukraine has no agency of its own. But the purpose of Putin's tendentious history is to demonstrate that Ukraine has no right to exist as an independent state, that it is an artificial creation and has an illegitimate government and should therefore return to its proper home. And that, I believe, is Putin's core motive. When Russians speak about the root causes that must be addressed if the conflict is to be resolved, they do tend to refer to NATO enlargement, but they also refer to an issue that hasn't been mentioned, is the position of Russian speakers inside Ukraine, although I have to say most Ukrainian Russian speakers that I know are desperately concentrating on their Ukrainian and don't want to speak Russian again. On NATO expansion, we've got to deal with this issue that was ever a firm promise. It was never a firm promise. And the discussions that have been mentioned took place in the context of NATO, of German reunification, when the Soviet Union was still whole. And it was not the collapsed Soviet Union that turned into 15 states. You can find comments by German Foreign Minister Genscher about the possibility of no NATO expansion, but he was countermanded by Chancellor Kohl, who vetoed the idea. Tony's mentioned the Founding Act. Yeltsin praised the Founding Act. He welcomed the Founding Act in 1997 when it came. This set up a joint NATO-Russia permanent joint council to serve as a venue for consultation, cooperation and consensus building. The two sides insisted that they did not see each other as enemies and also promised to refrain from, quote, the threat or use of force against each other as well as against any other state, its sovereignty, territorial integrity or political independence. So there was no promise against enlargement here, but there was a promise not to use force. The essential principle was that sovereign states could choose their own security arrangements, and that this could include membership of NATO. The important point about enlargement was that it was demand-led and not supply-led. NATO didn't go around saying, you've got to join us or else. Countries wanted to join NATO. Former members of the Soviet bloc were actively campaigning for this. Now, we don't know what the counterfactual would have been if NATO and the EU had not expanded and reflected this demand. But it's hard to believe that keeping so many states outside of established support structures would have been more stable and mutually beneficial. And I don't think if you went around to these new members of NATO now, do you really think this was a bad idea? Do you really wish you hadn't bothered? You'll find many takers. Most of them are really very pleased now to be members of the alliance. And you've got to also to remember that the history of these countries is of betrayal. The betrayal of Munich in 1938 and the betrayal in Yalta in February 1945 when they were consigned to the Soviet sphere. In the discussion prior to the full-scale invasion, NATO offered to go back to the Founding Act, which in 2014 had fallen into disrepute. They promised non-aggression, no offensive weapons would get too close. We know from a recent statement by Putin that Biden promised that he would exclude NATO, Ukraine from NATO for the next 5 to 8 years at least. And in fact, since the Bucharest summit has been mentioned, which was an absolutely sloppy piece of diplomacy, but what was clear was nothing was done then to make Ukraine a member of NATO, which is, that was a long time ago, and no moves had been made, nor would have been made if Russia hadn't invaded. And even now, it's still pretty difficult to see how this is going to happen. So why Putin's paranoia? I think it goes back to the Orange Revolution of 2004, when popular protest forced a rerun of a presidential election, which was widely assumed to be rigged, and which saw the pro-Western candidate poisoned, which is why he disappeared. After that, he was keen for Ukraine to be brought back into the Russian sphere. In 2013, he became alarmed that Viktor Yanukovych, as pro-Russian a Ukrainian president as you're ever likely to get, was going to sign an association with the agreement with the EU, not NATO. And he put Ukraine under extraordinary economic coercion to get the government to change its mind. And when he did so, when Yanukovych changed his mind, that's what prompted the revolution of dignity and led to the terrible events that we've seen unfolding. What Putin finds objectionable is not Ukraine's friendship, but its agency, its right to make its own decision and chart its own course. He was especially alarmed that he might turn into a Western democracy, for that might have been contagious and infected Russia. The creation of the pretext for the invasion followed the pattern of 2014 with an attempt to suggest that Russia was responding to a desperate plea from a beleaguered population, nothing to do with NATO. There are no honourable motives justifying Russian aggression against Ukraine. It was a terrible choice made for bad reasons. Whatever the faults of Western policy, it did not goad Russia into invading a sovereign country, occupying its land, bombing its cities, plundering its assets, murdering its people, abducting its children. Putin doesn't deserve our legitimation or our apologies. He deserves only condemnation and the determination to make sure that this reckless, shameful and unwarranted invasion is defeated.
I'm not going to reply to Lawrence's arguments. I have my own set of arguments, except to say that he shows no sympathy at all for the Russian position in this, and in fact he dubs it as paranoia. And that, I think, is something to bear in mind. In arguing Russia's invasion was provoked, I'm not saying that it was justified. There are different ways of responding to provocation. Provocation was real, but Russia's response in 2022 was fatally flawed. It overestimated the ease of overthrowing Zelensky and underestimated the support he would get from the West. One of its many adverse consequences, which we shouldn't ignore, was to turn most Ukrainians into bitter enemies of Russia. Having said that, we must also not ignore the provocation offered by Ukraine itself. Ukraine isn't plucky little Belgium or the Sudetenland. Ever since the 1920s, there's been a strong nationalist anti-Russian current located in Western Ukraine. Critically, the nationalist leader, Stepan Bandera, raised a Ukrainian army to fight with the Germans against the Russians. That's something deeply etched in Russian memory. And this helps to explain the formation of the military Azov Brigade in 2014 with its neo-Nazi symbolism, and also helps explain this otherwise mysterious pledge of Putin to denazify Ukraine as one of his war objectives. Western support for Ukrainian nationalism has added a crucial foreign policy dynamic to this cocktail by linking it to the West's aim of incorporating Ukraine into NATO. Hence the double Russian purpose of keeping Ukraine out of NATO and protecting Russian minorities inside Ukraine. Now, of course, Tony has dealt with the sense of betrayal of that broken promise, which Lawrence says was never sort of really seriously meant. And anyway, it was. But there are two betrayers in the Russian account of this. One is the Western powers, the Americans for making a promise they didn't intend to keep, and the other is Gorbachev for not tying down this promise into a new security treaty. For Gorbachev, for the West, Gorbachev is a hero. For the Russians, he's a traitor. When he ran for president against Boris Yeltsin in 1996, he received, do you know how many percent of the votes? 0.5%. A vivid memory of my own is being shown by a Russian officer the line of plinths of former Soviet leaders along the Kremlin wall behind the Lenin mausoleum in Red Square. On seeing a vacant plinth, I asked somewhat mischievously to the officer showing me around, is this being reserved for Gorbachev? To which I got the reply, no, his proper resting place is Washington.
Tony Brenton has shown how Western diplomacy heedlessly ignored Russia's quest for new European security system. After all, as Lawrence said, NATO is a purely defensive alliance, has no expansionist aims, no expansionist objects at all. You tell that to any number of countries around the world which have experienced NATO's peaceful intentions. Now, the immediate cause of the present war was the Maidan uprising of January-February 2014, which overthrew the pro-Russian government of Viktor Yanukovych and installed a nationalist president in his place. We in the West portray this as a popular rising against a corrupt and oppressive regime. The Russians see it as a CIA-financed and orchestrated coup against a democratically elected government. Backing the Russian version is the famous leaked telephone exchange between Assistant Secretary of State Victor Nuland, who just happened to be in Kiev while all this was unfolding, and the American ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt. And talk was about the desirable members of a new Ukrainian government. They were talking about the successors to the regime. When told that the European Union might object to their choice of prime minister, she notably replied, "Fuck the European Union." That's all on record. But of course, this doesn't prove that the Americans organized the Maidan. That there was a popular uprising is indisputable, but open US official encouragement of regime change plus covert financial and logistical support by the CIA was crucial to its success. Then we have the other episode, the failure of Maidan 2. Minsk 2. Maidan had led to the Russian annexation of Crimea and the insurrection of Russian-speaking provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk. France and Germany brokered a plan to end the fighting, which included granting a measure of self-government to the rebellious provinces. We see this as being sabotaged by Russian military support for the separatists. But there's plenty of evidence that Kiev was never willing to grant autonomy to the Donbass region, and now we have the admission by the former Chancellor Angela Merkel and former French President Hollande that the Minsk negotiations were a deliberate deception to buy Kiev time to crush the rebellion by force. So that's a second episode we need to take into account. Finally, what are we to make of Boris Johnson's visit to Kiev on the 6th of April 2022, 6 weeks after the start of the Russian invasion? A draft treaty between Ukraine and Russia had been agreed, which included provision, is a draft treaty, very important to emphasize that, which included provisions for Ukraine's neutrality and some security guarantees. David Arakmachia, Ukraine's chief negotiator, summed up the gist of Johnson's intervention as follows. Johnson brought two simple messages to Kiev. The first is that Putin is a war criminal, he should be pressured, not negotiated with, and the second is that even if Ukraine agrees to a compromised peace, they, the NATO powers, are not willing to agree. This amounted to an Anglo-American veto on further peace talks. Days after Johnson returned to London, a cascade of arms supplied from Britain and the United States was announced, and Putin declared that the talks had reached a dead end. Now, the story told by Tony and myself is not one of unfolding ambition of Putin to restore the Russian Empire, nor of paranoia at these about Western intention. It's rather a story of a humiliated Russia desperately trying to cling on to the remnants of its broken shield in face of relentless pressure by the United States using Ukraine as a Trojan horse for its political ambitions. Now, what distresses me most about mainstream British attitudes today, and I think some of them were echoed in the second speech, is that Putin is a reincarnation of Hitler, and that he's not.
I didn't say that.
No, you didn't. No, I said it's a very, very, very representative attitude, and that if he's defeated, he will go on and on. Together with this goes a gross neglect of the moral value of peace and indifference to the killing in what Boris Johnson himself called a proxy war. The death toll on both sides, do you know how much it is? About 300,000 or 400,000 soldiers alone have been killed, equal to the number of soldiers Britain lost in the whole of the Second World War. Of course, we shouldn't take the whole blame. After all, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. But we're guilty of egging the Ukrainians on. of adding to the provocation. So I think that's the sort of framework of how we should think of the future. It's only by accepting our share of blame for the carnage and understanding that appeasement is not the same as surrender that we will be morally fit to take part in the healing needed for a lasting peace.
Thank you, Bronwyn, and good evening, everyone. I was a NATO official in Moscow in the mid-1990s. And let me tell you, I had many discussions with the Russian side about NATO enlargement, the purpose of the alliance. And I can tell you this, that there's a danger in taking the Russian arguments at face value, because they very frequently contain half-truths. And we just had one half-truth there about the coup in 2014 in Ukraine. In my view, there was only one coup in 2014 in Ukraine, and it was in Crimea. So we haven't got time to go into these things, but one has to be very, very cautious with what the Russians say. I remember also in 2004, President Putin said when the Baltic states joined NATO that Russia didn't like it, but countries are free to make their choices. This had a great effect on the Germans, by the way. They thought, yes, Putin is actually on board now, which was, of course, an error, but it was interesting that the young Russian president at the time said that. I believe I'm probably not alone in this room in regarding this motion in some way as disrespectful, and I would say even insulting, to millions of Ukrainian citizens. Those citizens who, well before the start of the big war, had shown their allegiance to an independent Ukraine, and one free to choose its own destiny, because their choice is what provoked Russia and what provoked Putin personally. And as Laurie has said, the catalyst for this was in 2004. It was the Orange Revolution. Millions of people went onto the streets to signal to the Kremlin that Ukraine was an independent country capable of electing its own leaders without guidance or indeed interference from Moscow. Putin was shocked and humiliated by his miscalculation that he could simply shoehorn Viktor Yanukovych into the presidency. So the desire of Ukrainians for their country to develop along European lines and not on the template of Putin's Russia was the trigger, in my view, for the invasions of 2014 and 2022. It was this Ukrainian defiance that pushed Putin over the edge and persuaded him to intervene. Now, of course, it's fair to say that Western institutions and the Western way of life were undoubtedly magnets in this process. But this is entirely different from claiming that Western policy provoked the Russian bear into taking such an extreme step and made it attack the people it supposedly regarded as fraternal. The fact is that the Putin regime increasingly made Russia unappealing to millions of Ukrainians who were in fact previously well disposed to Russia and Russians and saw the countries as closely related. And by contrast, Europe exerted the force of attraction. Now Putin, if you analyse this, he has an absolutely terrible record of reading Ukraine over the past 25 years. He's clung consistently to this idea that the Ukrainians are really Russians who are simply in denial about their identity because of the flawed nationality policies of the Bolsheviks. He just can't get away from this. In 1991, formally, Russia recognized Ukraine's independence. But it was clearly from the early 1990s that there was a strong consensus in Moscow that Ukraine, like other CIS countries, continued in some way to belong to the Russia. And in the case of Ukraine, it was the depth of the historical relationship, the shared borders, the highly integrated economies, of course, and the millions of intermarriages that made it really inconceivable for the Russian elite that there could ever be a fundamental break with Ukraine. This was not a genuine acceptance of Ukrainian independence. And we saw tentatively under Ukraine's second president, Leonid Kuchma, the difference in political culture started to emerge. Ukraine's instinctive desire for freedom, a certain degree of chaos, one might say, their discomfort with strong centralized rule that they associated with foreigners. This encouraged the rapid and very rapid development of civil society in Ukraine. And at the same time, the differences between the west and the east of the country were becoming more visible as society in Ukraine desovietized at different speeds. And this was something the Russians would later play on when they took up the mantle of defending Russian speakers in Donbass. Political processes were running in separate directions in Russia and Ukraine, making a collision of interests, in my view, inevitable. Russia was becoming more repressive, as Tony was there, as the Putin system really cemented its rule. And meanwhile, Ukraine was becoming freer, and society was developing a voice. And the Orange Revolution was a stunning manifestation of this. The power of the street deeply scared the Kremlin. After all, Ukrainians and Russians in the Russian mind were one people, so it's possible this could happen in Russia as well. And it did. In late 2011, after Putin announced his intention to return to the presidency. These were by far the biggest protests that have been seen under Putin's rule, and they were driven by opposition parties demanding free and fair elections, not dissimilar to 2004 in Ukraine. The authorities held their own anti-orange protests. And I think this was the first real indication that the Kremlin saw that Ukraine had potential to become what they later called, and to this day call, anti-Russia. And by this they really mean a democratic alternative to the Putin model of governance, and therefore a threat to it. The annexation of Crimea and Russia's establishment of two separatist regimes in Donbass, they simply galvanized the process of Ukrainianization. This was not at root an issue of language, it was one of identity and values. You could be Ukrainian and you could speak Russian as your preferred language. But by rejecting Russia's veto on their desire to move closer to the EU, Ukrainians showed that they were not prepared to be simply subsumed into Putin's backward-looking Russian world. They didn't see the future there. The rest is history, and I dwell on this because what I find disturbing in the positions of those who argue the case of our opponents here is that they tend to treat Ukraine and its citizens as as objects rather than the subjects of policy. They want us to believe that Ukrainians are destined to take orders from Moscow because Russia is entitled to a zone of influence on its borders. This is the primary cause of the war. And if Ukrainians were happy to be a buffer state, subservient to Russia, then, in this argument, there would be no war. And this old thinking, I would suggest, is actually quite widespread. And I cannot resist quoting a letter of the Financial Times by one Tony Brenton in 2014. Days before Russia occupied Crimea, he totally dismissed the possibility of Russian military intervention and called it a dark fantasy. So 10 days later, Tony wrote to the Financial Times again to apologize for his error, and I'm struck by the words of that second letter. Tony wrote the following: "It will be argued that Russia's action is a throwback to a now extinct era of hard power. I'm afraid there's always been a fond delusion that great power politics today operate any differently from in all previous times. Thucydides is right." Now, for me, personally, to accept this argument in Europe requires jettisoning the belief in the core principles of European security embedded in the Helsinki Final Act and the Charter of Paris, signed by one Gorbachev, by the way. As Europeans, Ukrainians are gravely challenging the notion that might is right in international affairs. I am personally in no doubt that they will eventually prevail because they are morally right. Ukraine will preserve its independence and it will find a path to becoming a full member of the European family. But in the meantime, let there be no confusion about the cause of the war.
Can I just first express my thanks to the organisers and to the panel for this debate. It is the first debate I'm aware of in a university on this question. The fact that it had to be organised by a Committee for Academic Freedom, I think, speaks to the conformist intellectual environment we've had in this country over 7 years, so thank you. I think this debate is confused because the motion should be talking about a question of causation, and the people wishing to argue there is no provocation, take a moral line, and say there's no justification. There is a difference between explanation and justification, between theoretical and empirical explanation and the moral judgments we might make about that. The question I would put is, would any state, faced with a similar kind of strategic situation that Russia did, have behaved differently? If we imagine the shoe was on the other foot.
Which NATO member countries
Yes.
has a war right now? When we are talking about the reason why Ukraine faced a war, and also Georgia in 2008, because of, we are talking about NATO expansion. NATO member countries, so far, none of them the war there. So,
Thank you. Let's start with this side and the first question about whether you've confused justification with provocation and whether any state would have behaved differently from Russia, given that the question is calling provocation.
Give me a chance to reply so quickly. I mean, the security dilemma is a known feature of international relations, but first, Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council. This is embedded in the Charter of the United Nations. It wasn't the case that when Russia decided to attack a neighbouring state, the neighbouring state was just left to its own devices. Countries did come back and support it, and that's why Russia finds itself so stuck now. If you're going to do this sort of thing, and this was one of the things that a German said just the Munich Security Council conference just before the full-scale invasion. Well, if they are going to do it, I hope they get it over with quickly. What happened was Russia got itself and everybody else into a complete mess. And that reflects its own lack of understanding of the security situation in which it was operating. Lots of countries have difficult neighbours and managed to deal with them without invading them.
Roman, may I just
Yes,
also comment?
absolutely, because Rory says some very good points there, but I'm not sure completely nailed those parts of his question.
Okay.
Forgive me.
How about I could talk?
Well, I come from this looking at the facts. Where is the evidence that Ukraine was allowed to join NATO? There was no membership action plan. The NATO member states did not have a consensus on giving Ukraine at any point a membership action plan. And two of the key European members of NATO were against Ukraine joining NATO. And in fact, in Bucharest, had made sure that there was no membership action plan. Now, I personally was certainly not have issued that communique in Bucharest. I think it was completely unnecessary. And to some extent, it misled Ukrainians and Georgians. I think that was a really not very smart thing to do. But if you look at Ukraine in December 2021, who was batting for bringing Ukraine into NATO? The Biden administration was not interested in Ukraine. The European members of NATO, by and large, didn't want it, and this was kicked into the long grass. So there was no justification. It's simply some idea emerged into Putin's mind when he was in the bunker during COVID, that it really was about time the Ukrainians remembered that they were really Russians. And if they weren't prepared to do that, Zelensky defied him in 2019 by not agreeing to implement the so-called Minsk agreements on Russia's terms, and Putin has never forgiven him for that. He turned up to a meeting in Paris, advised that Zelensky was going to sign, and Zelensky didn't, because the information was incorrect. And he turned up looking super confident, and he went away angry. So I don't think he and Zelensky will actually ever meet again.
So in answer to this question, you're saying there was no provocation as well as there was no justification.
Yeah, there's no provocation.
Right. The two of you like to come back on that point, or then pick up the second question about the different experience of those within NATO and outside NATO.
Yeah, I've sort of got it entangled in my mind, but on the question of Ukraine moving towards NATO membership, the outcome of the 2008 Bucharest summit was treated by technicians, by people who worry about comments and so on, as, yeah, that's it, it's postponed. But the ordinary bloke who saw a statement in the outcome conclusions saying Ukraine will become a member of NATO kind of settled the matter, and in particular in Russia settled the conviction that they were facing a real problem in Putin's mind in particular. And while there was very little action between Bucharest and Putin's emergence from COVID, it is the case that over that period, first of all, NATO membership was written into the Ukrainian constitution. It was a demonstration of their determination to get in. And then secondly, a lot of practical cooperation, joint exercises, little intelligence sharing, bits and pieces of that emerged between Ukraine and NATO members, and indeed NATO socially. And the Russians said to themselves, okay, de jure it's off the table for the moment, but de facto it's actually happening. And that was part of the background, therefore, to Putin emerging from his purdah and saying we need to put a stop to that. Can I pick up what I think is a really fascinating point which John initiated, and then from how on earth he found that letter to the Financial Times? I'm very impressed. I'm not going to take it again. Anyway, but I hold to the view in that lesson. It would be delightful if we lived in a world of moral behaviour in international affairs. By everybody. Really anybody. Because after all, it's not only Russia that arbitrarily invades people whom it disapproves of. We invaded Iraq with no background justification whatsoever.
Absolutely.
It's not every nation, it's not only Russia which diverts us from the great principles of human rights in its foreign policy. Look at America's backing for Netanyahu now. Big states get away, and this is Thucydides exactly, get away with what they can. And that is as much a background for what Russia is up to as it has been, and will no doubt be again, to what the United States does. May not be desirable, may not be the way we would like the world to work, but it is the reality of the world that we live in, and let me offer a small, gloomy prediction. It's going to get more like that, rather than less, because Donald Trump is very much of the Thucydides persuasion.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Could I?
Yes,
Yes, I mean, why was that Bucharest announcement made that Ukraine will be part of NATO, which isn't, one can interpret as a promise? It was driven by the United States. What was happening in 2008, 2007, 2008, which impelled, convinced the United States this was a good moment to sort of start pressing for Ukraine membership of NATO. That's the point I'd like to explain, have explained. And the other thing is, yes, of course, there's say that Russia was provoked is not to say that that provocation was the only cause of what happened there after that. There was a lot of provocation from the Ukraine side. I think one of the things that is underplayed in the arguments from the other side is the extent of the division in Ukraine itself between people who, this is something brought out by Nikolai Petra's book on Ukraine, between the Galician side and the Russian side. And that was there. And therefore there was some provocation from Ukraine. And then on the last point, about international relations, yes, we all believe in a rule-governed order, and we believe in the United Nations Charter and all those sort of good things. But in fact, our side have broken all these things when it suits them. And therefore we can't attribute unique wickedness to the Russians in feeling a threat of Ukraine joining a hostile alliance. NATO was not devised as a sort of purely defensive alliance. Of course it wasn't. First of all, it was a rollback, then it was a containment. So all these things are etched in the memory of the Russians.
Both speakers against this motion have said that the friendly EU approach was being vetoed by the beastly Russians, whereas in fact the EU agreement, the Stabilisation and Association Agreement that the Ukrainians were being asked by the West to sign stipulated that there would be a deepening of the military cooperation between the West's military institutions and Ukraine. And at that time, the only real Western military institution was called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. One other quick question. We hear how many countries, these countries have a right to join NATO if they want. It's their right to choose. Sure, it's their right to choose. It's also NATO's right to say no, that we'd rather have a nice gap between ourselves and those beastly Russians. Let's just leave it as it is, because that's what we promised. NATO should have stuck to its promise, not trying to find an excuse in the pools of small nations for big protection from the big NATO alliance.
I believe that Russia did not care if Ukraine joined the EU. It would be beneficial to Russia. But NATO is unfortunately a red herring, and I don't believe, so I would like to ask whether this provocation should really be divided into two separate issues, the EU and NATO.
You're absolutely right to make the distinction between the EU and NATO. And it's quite a striking fact, both about the negotiations which took place right back when the war began between Russia and Ukraine, and actually about such documents that are on the table for the current negotiations, which are just getting going, that there's been no sign of any objection by the Russians to Ukraine joining the EU. And that's quite an important, I think, demonstration that what Russia's concern is, I think it's quite important to understand this concern. Russia's concern is a security concern. And the person who caught it best in many ways was President Trump, God bless him, who, after being told by the entire American establishment, the entire European security establishment, and everyone else, that, of course, Ukraine joining NATO was no threat to Russia, so therefore why were they complaining so loudly about it? Said, well, if I were president of a country whose capital was suddenly about to be 1,000 miles closer to my enemy than it had been before, I would feel pretty aggrieved at a world pushing me in that direction. And that was exactly what was going on. And it's quite striking to me, this sort of omerta, which has been held within Western security circles about that obvious reality, until it took President Trump to break it. Thank you.
Yeah. And of course, America hasn't ever renounced the Monroe Doctrine, and we might just keep that in mind. But of what was going on between the European Union and Russia in 2014, I mean, I buy the view that Yanukovych was playing both sides, and he looking for the side that would give him the better deal. And it was the rejection of the Russian deal offered that sparked a revolt. I mean, it's not the only thing that sparked the revolt, but it was one of the things that sparked the revolt. And that revolt wasn't a spontaneous uprising exactly. You have to ask who was involved in it, who the main actors were on the streets, what the role of the CIA was. All these questions have to be asked before we make too easy generalizations about the spontaneous uprising. There were never millions of people on the streets either. I mean, there were thousands of people on the streets, possibly hundreds of thousands if you take the country as a whole, but never millions of people.
First, Bucharest. Bucharest was a mess because it was Biden wanted Ukraine to join NATO, Merkel didn't.
Sorry, was who?
Merkel didn't want, Biden did. Bush, get my B's mixed up. Bush did. That was the origin of a sloppy bit of drafting, which caused a lot of harm. But the fact is, nothing was done after 2008 to get Ukraine into NATO. The distinction between the EU and NATO is important. The explanation from the lady from Donbass, I think, is there. The Yanukovych, it's not necessarily the case that those Russian speakers were opposed wholly to joining the EU for good economic reasons. The argument was a much bigger one, though, in 2013 when this started. It wasn't just Ukraine, it was also Armenia and Georgia that were going to sign association agreements. There was an alternative. Putin was putting his own Eurasian Union, which you may not have heard of, but was what Putin had in mind as an alternative. So it was not simply a question of don't join the EU, it was a question of join my alternative organisation. So that if Ukraine had gone in the other direction then and stayed with the EU, and incidentally the likelihood that the association agreement would have led very quickly to Ukraine actually joining the EU was pretty slight. But it was more a question of rejecting Putin's alternative. Armenia caved quite quickly under the economic coercion that Russia put Ukraine under in the summer of 2013. Again, the lady from the bus is quite right, that the IMF had conditions about corruption, which was a big issue, and so on. All Putin cared about was that Yanukovych went the other direction. Whatever, I think Russia now may well be prepared to allow the EU issue, but at the time, starting this whole wretched business, the EU was absolutely central. Just one final point. You can dismiss Euromaidan as much, but in both the question of Victoria Nuland's presence quite late on in the demonstrations, and the suggestion, the ludicrous suggestion that Boris Johnson told Zelensky not to sign an agreement when the revelations of Bucha had already demonstrated and made the Ukrainians unable to agree with Russia, with an incomplete agreement anyway, is always denying the Ukrainians agency, that they're not allowed to make up their own minds, that they're not allowed to upset Russia because Russia is more important.
We have the evidence of Ukraine's own negotiator.
One negotiator. We've got the treaty drafts. I can show you the treaty drafts. They were not complete treaties.
They weren't.
They didn't deal with territorial issues at all. They were being left for later.
Yeah.
They required the full disarmament of Ukraine. You know, they required disarmament of Ukraine. They put limits and caps on everything.
Yeah.
The idea, which you still see in Russian demands, was Ukraine must not be allowed to defend itself.
No, that's not the demand. It's the demand. One demand is that it should be neutral, and the other is that it shouldn't have offensive weapons.
But Russia, of course, is allowed as many offensive weapons as it wants.
Yes, absolutely.
I just really need to correct the point I believe that Rob's just made. If you trust the word of the former Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba, then during the negotiations with the Russians in Istanbul in April 22, one of the things the Russians wanted to do was to put all Ukraine's heavy weapons under Russian supervision. All of them. So if you're trying to claim that the Russians were cool with Ukraine having adequate defence forces,
I don't think that was one of the terms, actually.
Well, you speak to Kuleba. I'm just quoting him. It's in the Financial Times. You can find the interview. So
We've got the draft.
Financial Times and Thucydides getting very daring.
May I just address one other point, which I think is often forgotten. The criteria for membership in NATO, they're not absolutely firm, but they are understood. And if you look at the 1995 NATO study on enlargement, you will find this stated. The assumption is that countries that wish to join NATO will not have territorial conflicts with their neighbours. So the Russians had effectively got Ukraine and Georgia where they wanted them. Unless those conflicts were going to be resolved, which they weren't going to be, then that was in fact the biggest obstacle to those countries joining NATO. Tony, if I may, why you think that the Russians are cool about Ukraine joining the EU? Well, why did they object to it so much in 2013? I had Arkady Ostrovsky on my weekly webinar last week, actually, asking this question about the EU. And he said the Russians are quite happy to let Ukraine join the EU because A, they think it will never happen, and B, if it were to happen, then it would be this sort of poison pill that would enter the EU and create chaos. So there's a Russian view for you.
Do you think this is down to a leadership problem
whereby when Russia was on its knees after the Soviet Union fell apart, that it was, I think, treated quite disrespectfully by American presidents. I just think that they could have kept the conversation open.
So my question is quite simple. It's in regards to the side that was arguing for the Russian aggression without Western intervention. My question is very simple. So you said that the Ukrainians are very determined to fight against the Russians, which by no means is no debate. I agree with that as a Ukrainian myself. However, I'm not so convinced that the Ukrainian soldiers are fighting out of anti-Russian hate, rather than they're fighting for their lives, because the Ukrainian government is forcefully conscripting many of these Ukrainian fighting males who do not want to fight. And there's plenty of videos of this online circulating. So my question is essentially, how determined are the Ukrainians to fight for independence and sort of as an anti-Russian sentiment, or are they really just fighting because they're scared of death?
Are there lessons to be learned from the bloodless strategies adopted by Finland and Sweden for over 75 years after World War II?
Okay, I'm just going to go straight to the leadership question, which I think is a very important one. And of course, in the Russian narrative, Russia was terribly humiliated in the 1990s. I fully accept, having lived there at the time, it was an extraordinarily difficult time economically for probably the vast majority of Russian citizens, and it was not pretty to behold. As far as the way US presidents treated Russia, I think there's no question that Bill Clinton went out of his way to nurture this relationship with Yeltsin. And then when Putin came to power, George W. Bush looked into his eyes and saw his soul. George W. Bush met Putin 40 times. 40 times. And I think that attests to the fact that on the US side they were keen to cultivate a relationship with Putin. And I think that Putin started to distinguish Bush, in fact, from what he regarded as the hostile US deep state. It's quite interesting phenomenon.
Great on that. Anything on Finland and Sweden, or are Ukrainians fighting for independence or just for survival from conscription?
I don't think the latter. I mean, obviously, some people may feel coerced into fighting, but an awful lot of them are really not. And they're sticking at it in circumstances which are appalling and very difficult. Nobody should underplay what Ukrainians are going through, but I can't speak for Ukrainians. You could ask the Russians who are being used as expendable infantry and being forced against drones, what they think about it. Infantry never like wars, for good reasons, because 80% of them provide the casualties. So this is but if you have to ask other questions, 444 drones were sent against Ukraine the other night. Ukraine keeps on going. And I think that's a testament to their resilience. On Sweden and Finland, what's really interesting is two countries who thought themselves quite happy with neutrality. Finland, of course, being one of the few countries to have really given the Russians a run for their money in warfare during the Winter War, decided that in these circumstances they'd better join NATO. So really, if the object of this was to stop NATO enlargement, it's been a massive failure. Because to stop Ukraine, which was not going to join NATO, joining, they've now encouraged Sweden and Finland, which were never going to join NATO, to join.
On the relationship between the various presidents, it of course was dictated for most of the time by the fact that Russia was a supplicant, that Russia broke, that the Soviet Union collapsed, leaving a complete mess behind it. It was humiliated. It was utterly dependent on the United States for an awful lot of its ability to function effectively in the world. That said, it is quite, and I think at the personal level, it worked quite well, actually, on occasions. Clinton
used to refer to Yeltsin as old Boris. And I saw Clinton with Yeltsin once. They were backstabbing chums in some ways, you can imagine it really. That said, what is striking to me is that over 3 Russian presidents, the point when anger really broke out each time was over expansion of NATO. It was the breach of the undertaking given to Gorbachev when I was back. It was the actual expansion, and Yeltsin getting up on Russian television and saying, okay, it's peace, but it's going to be a cold peace. And then it was when Ukraine was drawn into the equation and Putin was there, and Putin said, in effect, to Bush at the Bucharest summit, famously claimed had no effect on Ukrainian membership. I think that's bonkers, actually. And the other, an aside, Bucharest did 2 things. It did Ukraine, Ukraine's going to join NATO. It did Georgia, Georgia's going to join NATO. Georgia took that undertaking seriously, and then, many of you will not have heard that this is the fact of it, attacked Russian troops in...
Are you serious about this statement? I'm really sorry, but I'm Georgian and you are saying this small little Georgia attacked Russia.
Yes.
Are you kidding us?
Yes, I do.
Yes, you are kidding us.
All right.
Can you see the map? Can you see on the map Russia and Georgia and say after that Georgia attacked Russia?
The Russians, I was in Moscow at the time, and I went to see my opposite number in the Russian Foreign Ministry, and I had a little note of complaint about the Russians attacking the Georgians. And he said to me, but Tony, they fired first. And no, we didn't believe it in Europe. So actually, a very nice Swiss lawyer called Heidi Talevini, I think all Swiss ladies are called Heidi, put together a little group on behalf of the EU.
I'm sure this is the debate to make the
I will finish very quickly, to investigate the beginning of the Georgian War. And the conclusions of that group were very clear. It was the Georgians who attacked the Russians in South Ossetia, and they were as baffled as you and I are. But the answer is, and this is the difference that Bucharest made, Bucharest gave the Georgians the confidence to do it in the expectation that the Americans would come in and back them. Bucharest was not the cipher which our opponents over there dismiss it as. Maybe I better stop there.
I think we're scooting out of time.
Okay.
That's one really quick.
My central point. Really, that America never offered Russia a new security organization to replace NATO. Once the Warsaw Pact had collapsed, NATO was the only European security organization. NATO was not was set up the history as an explicitly anti-Russian organization. Therefore, why should the Russians, with NATO being the only security system in Europe, have confidence that it had changed its spots?
So now we're coming almost to the end. I'm going to ask them one question each, and I suggest we take these as their closing remarks, because we need time for the vote. So let me say to this side, and these are points that have come up from each other, but also from the questions here. To this side, the charge is nothing was done after 2008 to get Ukraine into NATO, therefore there was no provocation. And to your side, a challenge that the West has not stuck by the rules-based international order that it created. Why hold Russia to this standard? I'll start with you.
Okay, well, in fact, I've already answered this question. Yes, there was nothing done on paper, but there was a steadily rising level of practical cooperation. The military forces exercising together, exchanges of intelligence, all of that. And the Russians drew the conclusion that, okay, there seems to be a de jure check on Ukraine joining NATO, but in the meantime, the evil Americans and the evil Europeans were working their way around that by creating these de facto links. And let me come, sorry, I did a small addition to that because I think it was John who mentioned that you can't join NATO if you have to dispute a territory clause. It's not a clause, it's a political statement. And you will all remember that as we got into the whole Ukrainian war and all that, what do we do about Ukraine and how do we get Ukraine into NATO fundamentally, somebody said, oh yeah, look, divided Germany was a member of NATO for years and years and years. Of course you can get around the divided nation clause if possible. So, you know, there was practical movement on the ground, there was people looking for legal arguments to get NATO in, to get Ukraine in.
Okay, thank you.
It would be very foolish to make a case criticising Russia for an invasion of Ukraine on the assumption that the West has been clean and good and virtuous in everything it's done, because clearly not. I spent 7 years of my life investigating the UK and the Iraq War. The conclusion was damning, but we could do that. We could criticise our government and suggest ways in which you could avoid making similar errors in the future. You could only do that with a moral compass. We can criticise ourselves with a moral compass, we can criticise others. Otherwise you are left with a right next mind. And we can be honest and analytical about the state of international affairs. We know it's how it works, and that's not the same as saying this is how it should be. We can argue a different thing. Can I just make one final point about Bucharest? I just had a very interesting remark. At the Bucharest summit, Putin was there, but Ukraine wasn't. Putin was there because under the founding act he could turn up. George Robertson, who used to be Secretary General of NATO, I've heard him say this, he doesn't mind, said he met with Putin 9 times. Never once did they discuss NATO enlargement.
Oh, that's not my recollection.
No, okay, we have no more time for history. We are in the present, heading to the future. Let's have a vote.
We've got a total, and in fact, both sides have increased, I think because quite a few people have joined us. So we now have, on the provoked side, 37, as opposed to 31, and on the not provoked side, we have 52, as opposed to 45. So they've both increased by 6 or 7. I don't know what we make of that.
They both increased, but they was not increased by proportionately slightly less. Well, they both increased, but you by 1 more. We can argue out after this. I want to thank, before thanking the panellists, I want to thank Edward Skidelsky and the Committee for Academic Freedom for putting this together. It took some doing, and I think we're all very appreciative of the fact that it happened. Please join me in thanking